When you future generations speak of me, you always love to pin all sorts of intimidating labels on me. The last poet of the Middle Ages, the first poet of the New Age. In your imagination, I am likely forever that statue on an altar, wearing a laurel wreath with a cold, stern profile, standing high above and looking down upon the mortal world. But if you truly want to understand me, please take this glaring laurel wreath off my head. Come back with me to that summer of 1265. Close your eyes and smell the mingled scents in the air of Florence, the foul stench of the flooded Arno River, the pungent smoke from the street blacksmith shops, and the cloying sweetness of cheap perfumes worn by the nobles. That is where I was born. My name is Dante. My family, to be honest, is quite laughable. The older generation always loves to boast at the dinner table about the glory of our ancestors who followed the emperor on the Crusades. But every day when I open my eyes, what I actually see is the faded, peeling family crest on the walls of our decaying mansion. The so-called nobility is nothing more than a magnificent but tattered robe crawling with lice. The reality of my family's decline is like the cold winter rain in Florence, beating bitterly against my youthful face. Walking down the street, wearing a silk coat with frayed edges, I watch the nouveau rich merchants parading around, waving their gold coins. In my heart, there was only a deep sense of humiliation and bewilderment. A penniless noble, even the stray dogs on the street dare to bark at you. But fate hasn't been too cruel to me. It closed my door to worldly power, yet left a skylight open. That window was pushed open for me by a scrawny old man named Brunetto. You might call him a renowned scholar, but in my eyes, he was just an eccentric marinated in the scent of parchment and ink all day long. In that dimly lit study, illuminated only by a few cheap beeswax candles, he didn't teach me how to flatter and fawn at the royal court, nor did he teach me how to loan money at high interest in the marketplace. Instead, he slammed a pile of dusty Latin scrolls heavily onto the desk in front of me. Stirred-up dust danced wildly in a slanted beam of sunlight streaming through the window. "Dante, look at this dust," he pointed at the floating motes in the light, his voice hoarse yet resonant as a tolling bell. "The wealth of Florence, the scepters of power, and even those arrogant families, in the end, they will all turn to dust. But words will not, and neither will thoughts." Right there in that musty room, Brunetto peeled away my narrow-mindedness bit by bit. He guided me in devouring obscure Latin texts, taught me how to find the sharpest dagger in the labyrinth of rhetoric, and showed me how to capture the wind's sigh with poetry. Even more fatally, he forced St. Augustine into my soul. I was still too young back then. Whenever I read Augustine's Confessions, I would often break out in a cold sweat in the dead of night. By the flickering candlelight, I stared at my distorted shadow cast upon the rough wall, feeling a deep sense of dread for the very first time. Just how deep do the desires of the human heart truly go? Are our struggles in this mortal life merely for the vanity of a few gold coins, or are we trying to leave something behind in the face of eternity? Brunetto's teachings acted like a chisel, carving a bottomless void into a heart that once held nothing but family resentment. I suddenly realized that compared to the warring factions slaughtering each other for power on the streets of Florence, the pen in my hand could forge an empire stronger than any castle. To fill this void, I fled the Philistinism of Florence and plunged headfirst into the hustle and bustle of Bologna and Paris. What a time that was! Today, you go to university just to get a paper diploma. But back then, I was like a starving man who hadn't eaten for days, throwing myself into the mire of knowledge and devouring it ravenously. Under the porticos of Bologna, listening to the crude notes of a vagabond's lute drifting from a tavern, I turned back to my humble studio to study how light and shadow carved creases of compassion at the corners of the Virgin Mary's eyes. On a bitterly cold winter night in Paris, wrapped in a tattered cloak, I gathered with a group of equally penniless students by the seminary fireplace. We argued over a theological concept until we were red in the face, even coming to blows. I have witnessed the most sacred masses and the filthiest alleyways. I have read the purest philosophy and lived through the most brutal history. Painting taught me how to outline the flames of hell with color. Music let me hear the rhythm of the celestial spheres turning in heaven, while theology and history revealed to me the tragic destiny of mankind, looking up at the starry sky from the mud. To others at the time, these things seemed like a useless hodgepodge. They couldn't be traded for bread or official positions, but I knew they were fermenting in my blood. On the morning I returned to Florence from Paris, I stood on a hill outside the city, overlooking the city that birthed and raised me. The morning mist had not yet lifted, and the red dome was faintly visible in the glimmer. I was no longer that fallen aristocratic youth who felt ashamed of wearing torn clothes. My pockets were still completely empty, but my mind now held the entire universe. Those tedious Latin letters, the dried paints in the studio, and the theological interrogations that tormented me in the dark of night, all of them transformed into an unstoppable torrent at this moment, surging wildly within my chest, seeking an outlet to burst forth. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, touching the ink-stained quill tucked inside my coat. Oh, Florence, are you ready? Is the world ready? I will use a lifetime of wandering, along with all my despair and deep devotion, to write you a song of eternity. The version of me you see today in art galleries and history books always wears a laurel wreath, with a high-bridged nose and a stern expression. You revere me as the last poet of the Middle Ages and the first poet of the new era, seeing me as the literary giant who wrote the Divine Comedy, an aloof and untouchable god. Cut the crap. If you strip away the gilded facade imposed on me by later generations, in that spring of 1283, I was nothing but an absolute loser. A coward who didn't even dare to say hello to the girl I liked. Let me tell you about that day. I was 18 years old, and the Florence sun was almost blindingly bright. The Ponte Vecchio wasn't just a bridge, it was the center of the universe where I lingered every day like a stalker. Spots of light danced like shattered gold on the surface of the Arno River, and then she walked toward me. Beatrice. She wore a long, deep red dress. Not a flashy red, but a quiet, profound shade that could instantly siphon all the air from my lungs. As she walked along the cobblestone path, the hem of her skirt gently brushing the ground, even the dust motes in the air seemed to dance for her. What was I doing? My palms were slick with cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest like a broken drum, my throat feeling as though it were stuffed with dry hay. I didn't even dare to look her in the eyes. I looked down at the ill-fitting, worn-out clothes I was wearing, my mind racing. What could I possibly offer her? I was just a penniless boy with a head full of unrealistic fantasies, while she was so dignified and elegant, like a radiant angel. She walked up to me and paused. I swear she looked at me, her eyes filled with an incredibly gentle, refined smile. If only I had opened my mouth, even just to stammer out, "The weather is really nice today," our story might have been rewritten. But I didn't. Like a petrified statue, I stiffly and comically gave a single nod. Yes, just a nod. She returned my greeting, then brushed past me. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 9 seconds. Yet those 9 seconds were like a rusty nail driven ruthlessly into the very bones of the rest of my life. Do you know how cruel reality is? Reality doesn't care at all about the earth-shattering romance playing out in your mind. A few years later, the bells of Florence rang out, and she was married. The groom, of course, was not me, but a respectable banker who could offer her a stable life. That day I stood from afar watching the sunlight catch her bridal veil. I cowered in the shadows like a stray dog drenched in the rain. But I was still holding on, comforting myself. It's all right, Dante. As long as she remains in this city, as long as you both breathe the same Florentine air, even if she never knows you for her entire life, it's enough. However, God refused to grant me even this pathetic self-deception. When she was 25, a sudden fever took her away. I didn't cry when I heard the news. I just felt as if the back of my head had been violently smashed by a heavy iron hammer, leaving a sharp, piercing ringing in my ears. I burst out of my house, running back to the Ponte Vecchio like a madman. There was no sunlight that day. The water of the Arno River looked like thick, viscous black mud, exuding the foul stench of death. I leaned over the bridge railing, staring fixedly at the water's surface, fantasizing that the dark red dress would reflect in it once more. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing. Only the freezing river wind whipped against my face, cutting into my flesh like a knife. I fell ill. A high fever plunged me into delirium night after night. I refused to eat, becoming emaciated. Lying on my moldy bed, staring at the spider webs on the ceiling, I actually felt a morbid sense of pleasure. Take me away, I thought. Burn me to death or starve me as long as I can see her again on the other side. But I didn't die. Late one night, I suddenly woke up. The pale moonlight, like a cold and ruthless sword, cleaved through my narrow room. In that absolute dead silence, I suddenly shivered, not from the cold, but from fear. I realized something truly terrifying. If I died, or if I just rotted away in this bed, who in this world would remember Beatrice? Decades from now, she would become nothing more than a blurred name on a tombstone. No one would know that she used to wear a crimson dress. No one would know the way the breeze caught her hair as she walked across the old bridge. And no one would know that she had once effortlessly lit up the entire life of an 18-year-old boy. No, I couldn't let her just disappear. I had to keep her alive. I dragged myself out of bed and stumbled over to the desk. My hands trembled so violently that I knocked over the inkwell. The black ink seeped across the rough parchment, much like my own heart, long festering, yet beating anew in excruciating pain. I grabbed my quill. I no longer cared about family honor or the political turmoil of Florence. Word by word, I recopied the love poems I had written for her while hiding in dark corners over the years. Poems even I once found overly sentimental. Amidst the scratching of the nib against the paper, I seemed to see the Ponte Vecchio of 1283 once more, and that beam of golden sunlight. I named this poetry collection La Vita Nuova, because the insecure, cowardly boy who only dared to nod on the old bridge had already died the day Beatrice died. And the man holding the pen right now is a monster reborn from her ashes, rising from the flames of that long, desperate, unrequited love. Later literary critics would examine this book under a magnifying glass, praising the brilliance of its sonnets and the delicacy of its emotions, calling it a monument in the history of Western European literature. They don't know shit. That was never some literary masterpiece. It was a paper mausoleum I built for her, brick by brick, with my own blood and tears. It was an apology, an entire lifetime late, carrying endless remorse. I'm sorry. That day on the bridge, I didn't dare to say I love you. Beatrice, you only lived for 25 years in reality. But as long as human civilization endures, as long as even a single pair of eyes reading my words, you will never die. You all always assume I'm just an infatuated poet, clutching a quill all day, weeping over parchment for my dead first love. You see me in the statues of later generations, wearing a laurel wreath with an aquiline nose, downturned lips, and eyes as deep as a dry well, as if I were born living in the clouds, utterly detached from the mortal world. But today I invite you to lean in a little closer and smell the scent on me. There was no scent of roses, no fragrance of holy water. Hidden within the folds of my robe were the smells of sulfur, moldy parchment, pungent herbs, and the dried, unwashable stench of blood from the streets of Florence. That year I was almost 30. 30 is a cruel age for a man. You begin to realize that no matter how many sonnets you write, they won't buy you bread. The most magnificent rhymes cannot block the hidden blades of assassins lurking in the alleys. My hometown, Florence, known as the City of Flowers, was in truth a manic beast, and I no longer wanted to be a mere spectator on a balcony, lamenting the passing seasons. I wanted to pry open the jaws of this beast and tear out its fangs. But in Florence, power is a dirty game with a steep price of admission. A noble title here is not merely a worthless piece of paper, it is a liability. To secure a ticket to the political arena, I, the descendant of a fallen aristocracy, a proud poet, had to swallow my pride and knock on the doors of the Guild of Doctors and Apothecaries. Isn't it ironic? Dante, the author of La Vita Nuova, registered as a certified apothecary. That day, I stood before the guild's dimly lit counter, surrounded by the rhythmic, muffled thuds of pestles grinding herbs, breathing in air thick with the pungent scents of cinnamon and myrrh. I signed my name, Dante Alighieri. At that moment, I locked away my poet's pride, along with my youth, in the drawer of a medicine cabinet. I started learning to read ledgers, learning to haggle in the council with a hoarse voice against garlic-breathed merchants. My hands were no longer meant only to caress parchment. They became stained with dust, ink, and the foul stench of power. I thought that as long as I worked hard enough, as long as I climbed high enough, I could prescribe a cure for the fever of this maddened city. In 1300 AD, I reached the pinnacle of my life. At 35, I was elected as one of the 6 priors of Florence, the highest governing body of the Republic. I still remember the scene of my inauguration day. The Tuscan sun slashed through the arched windows of the Palazzo Vecchio like a golden sword, striking my face. I stood on the high balcony, overlooking the Piazza della Signoria. Below me was a dense crowd, red rooftops gleaming in the sunlight, and the Arno River cutting through the city like a silver ribbon. At that moment, as the wind billowed my deep red robe, I truly believed I was the king of this city, the savior who could drag it out of the mire. But I was wrong. I overestimated the power of reason and underestimated the ugliness of human nature. Florence at the time had long been torn in two, the black Guelphs and the white Guelphs. Sounds like a joke, doesn't it? In the same city, sharing the same faith, and sometimes even brothers from the same family, yet because of an unequal division of spoils, they donned different colored clothes and slaughtered each other in the streets. By day, the council chamber was filled with endless cursing, the smashing of cups and the tearing of collars. By night, the narrow cobblestone streets were illuminated by flickering torches, accompanied by the muffled thuds of swords hacking into bone. I sat behind the magistrate's wide oak desk. The reports presented to me every day were either about a shop being burned down or another throat-slit corpse turning up on a street corner. Pungent, thick smoke often drifted in through the window, the result of compatriots burning the homes of their own people. Faced with such madness, what did the others do? They took sides one after another, either donning black attire or white robes, howling along with the fanatic crowds, because in this era, neutrality meant being attacked from all sides. But I refused. I am Dante. The innocence of a poet and the unyielding pride of an idealist still linger in my bones. I looked at the politicians in the council chamber, arguing until they were red in the face over petty gains, and violently slammed my hand on the table, knocking over the inkwell. Black ink dripped down the parchment onto the cold stone floor, looking exactly like the endless poisoned blood bleeding from this city. "Enough!" I roared at them. "How long will you keep bleeding Florence dry?" I tried to use the power in my hands to stop two carriages colliding at high speed. I became a solitary mediator, dancing on the blades of the black and white factions. I met with the leaders of both sides, pleading with them earnestly. I even invoked my privileges as a magistrate, forcibly issuing decrees in an attempt to restore constitutional order. To prove my absolute impartiality and to quell this damned internal strife, I made the most painful decision of my life. It was a stifling summer night. The candle on the table crackled, its light stretching my shadow against the stone wall, twisted and lonely. With trembling hands, I pressed the bright red wax seal onto the list of exiles. That list contained not only the names of black Guelph thugs, but also those of white Guelph radicals. And one of those names was Guido Cavalcanti. Who was he? He was one of the leaders of the white Guelphs, but more importantly, my best friend and my mentor in poetry. We used to discuss literature together along the banks of the Arno River, writing poems for the women we loved. But now, for the sake of this city's peace, I have personally signed his order of exile. The moment the ink dried, I covered my face and let out the mournful wail of a trapped beast in the empty council chamber. With my own hands, I had banished my best friend to a miasma-filled land of exile, where he would contract malaria and die shortly after. I thought this almost self-destructive impartiality would bring the fanatic factions to their senses, allowing them to witness the majesty of the Republic's laws. But I was too naive. An idealist facing the political meat grinder is like a fool fighting windmills with a wooden sword. My neutrality did not buy peace. Instead, it made me a thorn in the side of both the black and white factions. The blacks believed I favored the whites, while the whites felt I had betrayed my brothers. I tried to single-handedly prop up the collapsing Florence, unaware that the city was already rotten to the core. It didn't need salvation. It only needed to vent. That summer of 1300, standing in the shadows of the Palazzo Vecchio and watching the crowds still fanatically brawling in the piazza, I suddenly felt a bone-chilling cold. I sacrificed everything for Florence, soiled my hands, betrayed my closest friends, and buried my youth. Yet, the city I loved so deeply was secretly sharpening its knives, preparing to exile this anachronistic magistrate, along with all my ideals, once and for all. It was the pinnacle of my political career, and the beginning of my descent into hell. Little did I know then that this very shattering of reality would one day force me, through the long dark nights of exile, to write the true divine comedy in blood and tears. Have you ever smelled the stench of your own flesh burning alive? I have not. But in the spring of 1302, the acrid stench of charred wood and ash was already being smothered tightly against my face by the rulers of Florence. My name is Dante. In your history books, I am the exalted pioneer of the Renaissance, the great poet with a laurel wreath and a cold, stern profile. But if you rewind time to that year and look at me standing in the dark, damp cobblestone alleys of Florence, you would see that I was nothing more than a defeated stray dog, stripped bare by the games of power. That year I was 37, an age when a man is brimming with ambition. I sat in the seat of Florence's highest magistrate, wholeheartedly believing I could save this city. I loved her. In countless dusks, I watched the setting sun plate the cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore with a rose gold edge. I called her the most beautiful daughter of Rome. But this beautiful daughter, manipulated by political enemies, tossed me into the stinking gutter of power like a bloody rag. Corruption and embezzlement. When these words, written on parchment and sealed with the bright red wax stamp of the Republic, were thrown into my face, I found it utterly absurd. I, Dante Alighieri, a man who would gladly tear out his very soul to offer to the city-state, they actually accused me of corruption. The court's verdict was like a relentless death warrant. Pay 5,000 florins within 3 days. What do 5,000 florins even mean? It is not a fine, it is a ransom for my dignity. Not only do they want to drain my estate, but they also want to strip me of all public office and banish me into exile for 2 years like a plague. That night, I stood in my empty, unlit room. Moonlight pierced through the gaps in the shutters, slicing across my face like cold, hard blades. My friends urged me, swallow your pride, Dante. Pay the money, confess, and survive to fight another day. I stared at the silhouette of Florence outside the window and clenched my jaw. Pay? Paying means admitting guilt. I would rather have my bones shattered inch by inch than ever bend my spine to these shameless, scheming politicians. I refused. I naively believed that the truth would eventually come to light, and history would prove my innocence. But I underestimated the malice of human nature. 3 months later, when the final verdict of the trial in absentia was handed down, I was walking along a muddy road outside the city. The messenger's hands were trembling as he shoved the decree into mine. I unfolded the paper, and it glaringly read, "Permanent exile. If Dante Alighieri dared to step half a foot inside the Republic's borders, he shall be burned alive. Burned alive." I chewed on those words repeatedly, then suddenly burst out laughing. I laughed so hard that my tears smashed into the mud beneath my feet. I turned around and across the vast plains and gray mist, took one last look in the direction of Florence. The city gates were slowly closing behind me with the heavy, deafening roar of scraping iron, a sound like the final nail being driven into a coffin. From that day on, the proud magistrate Dante was dead. What survived was a ghost without a homeland. What do you think exile is? A poet touring mountains and rivers with a heart full of righteous anger? Bullshit. Exile is starving, facing cold stares, and walking on thin ice while living under someone else's roof. I went to Bologna. I went to Padua. For over 20 years I was kicked around like a ball by different lords. I wore a threadbare cloak with holes in it, trudging through the wind and snow of foreign lands. Do you know how salty another man's bread tastes? Do you know how hard it is to climb another man's stairs? Just for a bite to eat, just to beg for a desk where I can write in peace. I, a former chancellor, have had to learn to force fawning smiles before warlords who can barely read. Every late night, sitting alone in a drafty inn, looking at my freezing, cracked hands by the dim light of a cheap dying candle, I ask myself, why? Overwhelming despair and bone-deep homesickness tear at my nerves day and night like two saws. Countless times I have smelled the morning mist along the Arno River in Florence in my dreams, only to wake up to the cold stone bed of a foreign land. Since the mire of reality threatens to drown me, I can only climb toward the deepest starry sky above. Since this world has no place for me, I shall build my own city upon the ruins of the spirit. I pushed open the gates of philosophy. Those grease-stained and dust-covered pages became my only sanctuary. In those freezing winter nights where even my breath formed ice crystals, I dipped my pen into the blood of my own heart and wrote the banquet, Convivio. I crushed my yearning for my homeland, my thirst for truth, and my love for my long-departed first love Beatrice, spreading them all between the lines. The candlelight cast my hunched yet massive dark shadow upon the wall. Suddenly, I no longer hated the fire that threatened to burn me alive. Because I knew the fires of Florence could only destroy my flesh, whereas the roaring flames about to ignite from my pen would drag those despicable politicians, greedy popes, and this entire decaying era into the inferno forged by my own hands. Then, treading upon their ashes, I would walk step by step toward my own paradiso. I gripped my quill tightly. In the dead of night, the rustling of the nib against the parchment sounded like the marching of a massive army. You future generations are always so accustomed to hanging my portrait high upon the walls of your art galleries. In the portrait, I wear the laurel wreath of glory and a flawless red robe. My profile is stern, my gaze profound, as if I were born to be the unworldly last poet of the Middle Ages. But you have no idea how wretched I was in the winter of 1308. By then, I had been exiled from Florence for exactly 6 years. Do you know what exile feels like? It means another man's bread always tastes too salty, and another man's stairs are always too steep to climb. I wandered through the city-states of Italy like a stray dog, my boots caked in the mud of different territories, the hair at my temples having long since turned white. By day, I forced smiles under other people's roofs. By night, I stared at the oil lamp in a drafty inn, missing my Florence so deeply that my very insides ached. I thought I would rot away in this endless homesickness for the rest of my life. Until that day, a piece of news split the dark night above me like lightning. Henry of Luxembourg had been elected Holy Roman Emperor. You might wonder, what does a Germanic emperor have to do with an old Italian man like me? But in that moment, Henry was my god, the single piece of driftwood I clung to while drowning. The Italy of that time was shattered like glass shards across the floor, its city-states viciously tearing at one another. I desperately yearned for an absolute power to smash through this chaos like an iron hammer and piece Italy back together. But a deeper, more selfish desire remained. If Emperor Henry could just pry open the tightly shut gates of Florence with his sword, I, Dante, could finally go home. In 1310, when Emperor Henry's army finally crossed the Alps and set foot on Italian soil, you could never imagine my frenzy. I locked away all my sorrowful poetry manuscripts in a chest, mounted a swift horse, and charged into the rainy night. I was no longer just a mere scholar writing sentimental verses. I became the emperor's most fanatical disciple and envoy. In the piazzas of Milan, enduring the scorching sun and the spittle of the crowd, I delivered fiery speeches until my voice gave out. My voice grew hoarse, yet a terrifying light burned in my eyes. I delivered letters of state to every Italian monarch, shouting to anyone I met, "Look, the king who brings peace has descended. Italy is saved." That was the last great dream of my life. I had even rehearsed the scene of my return to Florence countless times in my mind. I would dismount before the baptistry of San Giovanni. Those who once exiled me would bow their heads to lead my horse, and I would touch the cold, hard marble pillars of the baptistry, breathing in the evening mist of the Arno River. But oh, my proud homeland, it slapped me ruthlessly in the face. The rulers of Florence tightly locked the city gates, not only refusing to bow to the new emperor, but even allying with other forces against Henry. The night I heard this news, I sat alone in a narrow room in Milan, the candlelight stretching my shadow on the wall like a twisted monster. Love pushed to the extreme turns into a bleeding hatred. Trembling all over, I grabbed a quill, the nib making a harsh scratching sound against the parchment. I no longer wrote poetry in the gentle Tuscan dialect. Instead, I penned curses in the most vicious Latin. I denounced the rulers occupying my homeland as the vipers of Florence, and with gritted teeth, I prophesied that they would surely be reduced to ashes in the flames of war. It was during those almost frantic days that I wrote De Monarchia. On paper, I constructed a perfect, orderly utopia, pinning all my political ideals on Henry the Great. I believed that as long as my writing was profound enough and the emperor's sword sharp enough, the icy walls of reality would eventually melt away. However, destiny loves nothing more than to kick you off the cliff at the exact moment you reach the edge and witness the sunrise. The summer of 1313 was stiflingly hot, making it hard to breathe. I was sitting in a tavern in Siena, calculating when the emperor's army would finally reach Tuscany. A dust-covered messenger burst through the door, delivering news that seemed to freeze the very air. Emperor Henry is dead, not killed in battle, nor falling heroically during a charge, but suddenly dead from an absurd bout of malaria, though some whispered of poison. The wooden tankard slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a thud as cheap ale splashed across my worn boots. The entire world went silent in that instant. I could no longer hear the raucous tavern or the hoofbeats in the street. I could only hear the deafening crash of something collapsing inside my own heart. I did not cry. Absolute despair sheds no tears. Slowly, I crouched down and picked up the empty tankard. At that moment, I realized with absolute clarity, it was over. It was all over. The grand ambitions I had pinned on the emperor, the last shred of hope of returning to the homeland I yearned for day and night, were all swallowed into the earth along with Henry's dying breath. The cruelty of reality lies in how it refuses to grant you even a dignified ending. My political career, my lofty aspirations to save the real world, ended just like a joke. And afterwards, you all know what happened afterwards. Since the real Florence would never open its gates to me again, and since earthly kings could not bring the salvation I desired, I would become my own god. I picked up my pen once more, no longer to write political manifestos, no longer to bow to any earthly monarch. I crushed all my anger, my despair, my love and hatred for my homeland, and paved them into a path leading to hell, purgatory, and paradise. You think the Divine Comedy is a great literary masterpiece? No, it is an impregnable city, built barehanded in the endless night by a middle-aged man who lost everything in reality, using his own flesh and blood. The wind in Venice is salty and damp, carrying the rotting stench from the deep swamps of the Adriatic Sea. It is now September 1321. I lie on a wooden bed in Ravenna, my forehead burning hot like a red coal just pulled from a blacksmith's forge. That damned fever felt like a cold, venomous snake, creeping up my shin bones inch by inch to tightly constrict my heart. I knew my time was running out. Outside the window, autumn sunlight filtered through the rough glass, casting mottled shadows over the scattered parchment on the floor. I struggled to turn my head, gazing at the split-nibbed quill on the desk and the thick stack of manuscripts, the Divine Comedy. The ink had dried, much like this hollow husk of my body, drained of its blood. Suddenly I felt the urge to laugh. 6 years ago, in 1315, Florence, the hometown I yearned for in my dreams, yet which had cast me out like a stray dog, had sent me a decree of amnesty. I still remember that night, the dim candlelight flickering glaringly. The messenger stood haughtily above me, unfurling the parchment, and said in a patronizing tone, "Dante, if you just pay a fine, put on a paper dunce cap, and kneel in the mud of the baptistry of San Giovanni like a thief to confess your guilt, Florence will forgive you. You can go home. Go home." I stared dead at that paper stamped with the lily crest, trembling all over. Was it excitement? No, it was a humiliation akin to being stripped naked and flogged in the streets. I was the magistrate of a city, a man who valued honor more than life itself. You stripped me of my property, burned down my home, sentenced me to burn at the stake, and forced me to wander in exile for over a decade, and now you actually expect me to pay for some fabricated pardon? Get out. I squeezed the word through clenched teeth, tearing the decree of amnesty to shreds and hurling it fiercely into the envoy's face. I swore to the swirling fragments of paper, if I cannot walk openly through the main gates wearing a laurel wreath, then I, Dante Alighieri, would rather let my bones rot in the wilderness of a foreign land than ever set foot in Florence again. But do you know what 20 years of exile actually means? You do not understand. You only see the gold-stamped name on the poetry collection, yet you cannot taste the bitter salt in another man's bread. You do not know how steep it is to climb the stairs of exile, nor do you know that on stormy, snowy winter nights I could only wrap my faded, worn red robe tightly around me, wandering like a beggar beneath the porticos of various nobles, enduring all their hypocrisy, arrogance, and cold stares. My political ideals are dead. My homeland has abandoned me, and there is no longer a place for me in this world. Since the earthly courts have sentenced me to death, I shall go to hell, to purgatory, and to paradise to judge this world anew. I crushed 20 years of humiliation, anger, and despair, those greedy popes and corrupt politicians, along with the mud caked on the soles of my shoes, mixing them with the blood from my heart to carve them line by line into the Divine Comedy. In the pitch-black dead of night, I lit an oil lamp and cleaved the earth apart in my mind, making those high and mighty figures wail in boiling rivers of blood and shiver at the frozen bottom of hell. That was the reality I despised most, yet it was also my sharpest weapon. But within that despair, blacker than ink, there was always a ray of light that gently cradled my fragile soul. Beatrice. Simply whispering her name in my heart would miraculously soothe the stinging pain all over my body. When I was 9 years old, on the spring streets of Florence, she wore a scarlet dress. With just one glance, she claimed my entire life. Later, she married another and passed away prematurely from illness at 24. When she died, most of my heart died with her, but the small piece that remained grew wings to fly toward heaven, all because of her. In reality, I am a weather-beaten, destitute, exiled old man. But in the Divine Comedy, at the highest peak of paradise, it is she, dressed in radiant white, smiling as she reaches out her hand, leading me across the dazzling stars. I transformed all the unspoken love and ungiven embraces of my life into verses, paving them beneath her feet. I trampled the world under my feet, yet offered my soul to her. My breathing grows heavier, my lungs heaving like a worn-out bellows. The bell tolls from the Basilica of Ravenna, echo from afar, muffled yet lingering. The nobles of Ravenna have been kind to me. They granted me my final dignity, allowing me to write the last word of the Divine Comedy in this quiet little town. These 20 years of exile have been like a long and agonizing alchemy. Fate has burned my flesh to ashes, yet forged these immortal words. Florence, you ultimately did not see the return of your son. Centuries from now, perhaps you will regret it. You will build magnificent empty tombs for me, weeping and begging for my bones to return home. But I no longer care. I feel my body becoming lighter. The gravity that has tortured me for 20 years seems to have vanished. It is as if I can see the Arno River of Florence once again, and by the riverbank, that young maiden in a red dress, walking towards me against the light. I am Dante Alighieri. I am the last sigh of the Middle Ages and the first ray of dawn of the new era. I could not return to my earthly homeland, but I have already stepped into eternity.